Henry Louis had everything a man could want: wealth, power, influence, but there was a hollow space in his life that no amount of money or status could fill. At 42, he was a man who had conquered the world of business, climbing to the top with ruthless precision and a calculated mind. He was known for making decisions with unwavering confidence, a man whose word was law, whose presence commanded attention. His private jet, his luxurious penthouse overlooking the New York skyline, his fast cars, these were the outward symbols of success. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the city noise faded and the lights dimmed, Henry felt a gnawing emptiness, a quiet desperation that he couldn't shake. He had been married twice. Both marriages, to women who were once the objects of his affection, had ended in bitter disappointment. The first had promised love and warmth, only to unravel in a series of misunderstandings, betrayal, and unmet expectations. The second, a union based more on social stature than genuine connection, had crumbled under the weight of pretension and lies. He had learned over time that love, in its truest sense, was an illusion, a myth that only served to complicate matters. And so Henry had retreated from the idea of intimacy, convinced that it wasn't worth the emotional investment. But the one thing Henry realized he needed more than anything was an heir. His empire, built from nothing, was his pride and joy. Yet without someone to carry it on, it would all fade into the background of history, erased by time. He was a man whose name would one day be forgotten unless he had a child, his legacy, his bloodline, a continuation of all he had built. He needed an heir, but he was done with love, relationships, and the messy entanglements that came with them. The idea of finding a woman to love, to build a family with, seemed laughable. For Henry, there was only one solution: an agreement, a contract. He needed a woman who could bear his child, someone who would offer up her body for the price of a new life, but without the emotional baggage. There would be no romance, no complications, just a transaction. He could afford to pay for it after all. He had enough money to make any agreement work in his favor, and he knew that somewhere out there was a woman who would accept the deal. A woman who didn't expect love. The next morning, as Henry drove through the bustling streets of Manhattan, his mind was focused on the task at hand. He had already drawn up the terms, contacted lawyers, and put his plan in motion. Now, all that was left was to find the right woman. He wasn't interested in a perfect candidate. He didn't need a woman who would offer up her heart or her soul. He needed someone who could fulfill one simple role: carrying his child to term and then walking away. As he came to a red light near a busy corner downtown, something caught his eye. A young woman sat on the sidewalk, sketching on a crumpled piece of paper, her messy brown hair falling over her face. Her clothes were ragged, and her appearance was that of someone who had seen more than her share of hardship. Yet despite the dirt and exhaustion, there was something about her that caught his attention. Her eyes, though tired, sparkled with a quiet intensity, as if she saw something beyond the grim reality of her situation. She wasn't begging. She wasn't asking for charity. She was simply existing in her own world, creating something with her hands. For a moment, Henry tried to dismiss the thought that popped into his head. He had a purpose, a plan, and he didn't have time to get distracted by the endless sea of people on the streets. But when the light turned green, he found himself looking back, watching her once more. Why would someone sit on the sidewalk, drawing, as if the world around them didn't exist? He shook his head, almost irritated with himself for thinking about it. He couldn't afford to be sidetracked. Yet, as he continued down the road, he felt a strange discomfort settle in his chest. Something about the woman lingered in his mind. He stopped the car abruptly in a parking lot, his thoughts racing. What was this? Why did he care about a random stranger sitting on a sidewalk? He had built his life on control, on the ability to make decisions that benefited him, to steer his life exactly where he wanted it to go. This distraction, this feeling, he didn't have time for it. After a few moments of silent contemplation, he found himself turning the car around, heading back toward the street corner where he had seen her. When he arrived, she was still there, leaning against the wall with the same piece of paper in her hands. He rolled down the window, his voice cutting through the air like a command. "Hey, you. Come here." The woman looked up slowly, her gaze cautious and wary as she assessed him. Henry didn't flinch. His tone remained firm, impersonal. I said, "Come here." There was a moment of hesitation before she stood up and walked toward the car, her steps slow, reluctant. When she reached the window, her eyes met his, challenging him. "What do you want?" Henry studied her for a moment. Her defiance didn't faze him. "Get in the car," he said flatly. "I need to talk to you." The woman's eyes narrowed. "I'm not one of those, if that's what you're thinking," she retorted, crossing her arms. He frowned, irritated by the assumption. "Don't be absurd. I'm not here for that," he snapped. "I just want to talk. Get in, or you can stay out here on the sidewalk." With a resigned sigh, she opened the door and climbed into the car, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. Henry drove them to a quiet cafe, parking the car in the lot. As they walked inside and sat down at a corner table, he fixed her with a cold, direct stare. "What's your name?" he asked. "Layla," she answered, her voice soft but guarded. She didn't offer more, keeping her distance. Henry studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "Why do you sit on the sidewalk drawing, as if nothing else matters?" he asked, his tone more curious than judgmental. Layla shrugged, her gaze dropping to the table. "What else is there to do?" "I have nowhere to go. I lost everything," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But it's none of your business." He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm offering you a chance, a way out, a fresh start." Layla raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued, but skepticism thick in her voice. "A chance? What kind of chance?" Henry's response was simple. "I want you to have my child." Her reaction was immediate, a burst of laughter escaping her lips. "You're joking, right? This is some kind of prank?" He didn't smile. "No joke. I'll pay for all your expenses. I'll take care of everything. You'll have full medical
support, and when it's done, you'll get enough money to start over. No strings attached. All you have to do is have my child."
Layla stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he was playing a cruel trick on her. But there was none. He was serious, cold, calculated, and utterly without emotion. "I don't know if you're insane or just that rich," she muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No woman would ever agree to something like that." Henry didn't flinch. "No woman in your position would refuse," he said bluntly. "I'm offering you security, stability, a way out. You just have to do what your body is capable of. Simple as that." Layla's arms crossed tightly over her chest as she processed his words. She wanted to refuse, wanted to dismiss him as just another rich man who thought he could buy whatever. He wanted, but the truth was, she had nothing. No home, no family, no future. And the more she thought about it, the more the idea of escaping the misery she had lived in seemed like the only way out. But was it worth giving up something so personal, so intimate for money? She looked up at Henry, her voice steady but uncertain. "And what happens after the baby is born?" she asked, needing to know how this would play out. Henry relaxed in his chair, as though he had anticipated the question. "You'll receive a large sum of money, enough to never worry about a thing again. You can walk away and live the life you choose. No emotional entanglements. You'll be free." Layla considered his words carefully. He wasn't offering her a family. He was offering her a transaction. There would be no love, no attachments, just a child and a contract. Still, The idea of a fresh start, of being free from the life she had been living, was too tempting to ignore. Finally, after a long pause, Layla made her decision. "I'll do it." Henry's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something. Satisfaction, perhaps, or something deeper in his eyes. "You won't regret this," he said simply. And so, without another word, their agreement was made. Neither of them knew what the future held, but they had both sealed their fate. They had entered into a contract that would forever change their lives. The decision had been made. It was as if Lila had signed away her freedom the moment she agreed to David's offer, and yet, the weight of it all didn't fully settle on her until she found herself in the back of a black car, the tinted windows blurring the view of the streets she had known for so long. The city outside was a blur of lights and movement, but within the confines of the car, it felt as though time had slowed down. Everything felt unreal. She had been told that she would be taken to a property on the outskirts of Manhattan, a mansion with more space than she could ever imagine, and a future she hadn't yet come to terms with. But there was something in her chest, a quiet, insistent flutter of anxiety that wouldn't let her relax. She had made the deal, yes. She had agreed to give David Alcott a child in exchange for a new life, but now, as she stared out at the world that was slowly disappearing behind her, she found herself questioning everything. The streets she had lived on for years, the cold, the hunger, the endless struggle. All of that had brought her to this moment. She had fought so hard to survive, and now she was being given a chance to escape that existence. But at what cost? Lila glanced at the driver, his face impassive as he focused on the road ahead. He didn't know her story, and she didn't expect him to. All he saw was a woman in a faded jacket, sitting in the back of his car, likely lost in thought. She was just another passenger to him. But for Lila, this was more than just a ride. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet grasp. She didn't know what it would mean to live in that mansion, to be taken care of by people who were paid to serve her. Would she even be able to adapt? Or would it always feel like an alien world, a life that was never truly hers? The car pulled up to the entrance of the mansion, and Lila was momentarily stunned by its grandeur. The gates were tall, intricately designed with towering pillars on either side, and the house itself loomed above, casting a shadow that seemed almost intimidating. It was a stark contrast to the cramped, cold spaces she had known for so long. This place wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of everything she had never had, a life she couldn't have imagined for herself. As the car stopped, a woman in a crisp uniform stepped forward. She introduced herself as Stephanie, David's assistant, and ushered Lila inside without a word of hesitation. The mansion was silent, too silent in a way. Every step she took echoed off the marble floors, and every door she passed seemed to open into another world, one more extravagant than the last. It wasn't just wealth, it was power. The power to shape lives, to control environments, to create an existence that others could only dream of. But as Lila was led through the halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. It was as though she was an outsider, watching someone else's life unfold around her. After a few moments, they reached a large suite. The door opened to reveal a room more beautiful than anything Lila had ever seen. A king-sized bed with luxurious linens, a sitting area by the windows overlooking the sprawling gardens, and a bathroom that could have been a spa in its own right. It was everything she had imagined when she first heard David's offer, and yet it felt empty. She was empty. Stephanie showed her the closet, filled with clothes, designer labels that Lila had only seen in magazines, and explained that everything was provided for her. Her medical appointments had been arranged, and she was to stay here. For the duration of the pregnancy, all expenses covered. The arrangement was straightforward. There were no strings attached, and Lila could leave whenever she chose, as long as she held up her end of the deal. Everything was planned out for her, every detail taken care of. She didn't have to worry about anything except for one thing: herself. David had offered her comfort, security, a chance at a new life. He had given her everything she had ever wanted, and everything she had never expected to receive. But now that she was here, it felt like the price was higher than she had anticipated. She wasn't just carrying a child for David. She was carrying a future that wasn't her own. She was a part of his plan, a cog in a machine that she couldn't quite understand. And as much as she wanted to accept the luxury and the ease of her new life, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The silence of the mansion pressed in on her. The grandiosity, the beauty. It was overwhelming. It wasn't her world. She didn't belong here. There was no one to talk to, no one to connect with. The staff moved like shadows, always in the background, their faces unreadable. She had been brought into this world, but it wasn't a place for someone like her. She was still the same woman she had been when she signed the contract. The same woman who had been left to fend for herself on the cold streets. Days passed in a blur. Lila spent her time adjusting to the routine of her new life. She went to medical appointments, met with doctors who spoke to her like she was a patient, not a person. The luxury of the mansion was beautiful, but it only served to remind her of everything she had never had. She was treated with care, but it felt sterile, impersonal. The staff was efficient, but no one asked about her life. No one seemed to care about her as a person. She was an object, a vessel, and that's all she was supposed to be. It was the deal she had signed up for. One evening, as Lila sat on the terrace, her sketchbook open in front of her, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. David. For a brief moment, she wondered why he had come. He had never been particularly present, always busy with his own affairs, but today, for some reason, he had chosen to come to her. "Do you ever stop thinking?" he asked, his voice a little less guarded than usual. "You always seem lost, in thought." Lila didn't look up from her sketchbook. "I suppose I do," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about a lot of things lately." David stood beside her, watching the faint lines of her sketches form on the page. "About the baby?" he asked, his tone soft. Lila hesitated before answering. "Yes, about the baby and everything else." David exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on the garden. For the first time, Lila saw something in him, something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't the cold, calculating businessman she had come to know. It was a man who was beginning to question his own choices. "I didn't expect this to be easy," he said after a long pause. "I didn't expect it to be this complicated." Lila didn't know how to respond. She had signed the contract, agreed to the terms, but now it felt as though both of them were living in a space between decisions, between past lives and futures they hadn't yet embraced. "I didn't expect it either," she said, her voice quiet. "But here we are." David nodded, his gaze still distant. "Here we are." In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't a grand gesture. There were no promises, no declarations. But for the first time, Lila felt like they were both on the same path, both trapped by their decisions. David, for all his wealth and power, was just as lost as she was. And in that shared silence, Lila realized something she hadn't expected to learn. She wasn't alone. Not really. They were both here, in this grand house, living out a story neither of them had ever planned. But that, Lila realized, was the high crux of it all. They had both made choices, and now they had to live with them. For better or worse, they had become part of each other's lives. And whether they liked it or not, there was no going back. Eva's life inside the mansion had settled into a strange rhythm, one she didn't quite understand but was beginning to feel the weight of more and more each day. When she first arrived, everything had been so foreign. The mansion itself, the staff, the luxury. It all felt like a dream she wasn't sure she deserved. It was a world she had only ever glimpsed in movies or glossy magazines, not one that she could ever imagine belonging to her. But as the days turned into weeks, something started to shift. The opulence of the house, once alien and intimidating, now felt more like a cage. Not a physical cage, but an emotional one. The silence of the mansion was deafening. There was no bustling street noise outside her window, no homeless people huddled in corners, no conversations happening on crowded subway cars. The stillness in the house was overwhelming, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how much noise there is in your own mind. Every corner of the house was perfectly designed, each piece of furniture more beautiful than the last, but none of it had any warmth. None of it felt like home. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the grand piano in the corner of the parlor, it was all just decoration. It was a life without meaning. Lila had expected this at first, of course. She knew this was the price of comfort. But what she hadn't accounted for was how much she would miss the rawness of her old life, the unpredictability, the challenges, the simplicity. In the streets, she had been forced to fight for every little thing: food, shelter, warmth. There had been something deeply human about that, even in its ugliness. Here, she was handed everything on a silver platter, but the price wasn't just her body, it was her soul. She spent her days in the guest rooms, filling her hours with routine, medical checkups, eating meals that were more extravagant than anything she had ever imagined, and resting. At first it felt like a relief. There was no fighting, no cold nights, no desperate search for a place to sleep. But as the weeks passed, Ava realized that this life of comfort was slowly suffocating her. She had been offered security, but not freedom. There was no room for choice here, no room for independence. She had signed away the most fundamental part of herself, the right to decide who she was, who she wanted to be, and what she would do with her life. Despite everything, there was one thing she had not expected: the growing presence of David in her life. He was a shadow at first, always around but never really there. He would check on her progress, ask how she was feeling, but there was no emotional connection, no real conversation. He remained the businessman, and she, the woman who had agreed to carry his child. That was the deal, and neither of them needed anything more from it. But then, something began to change. David wasn't just the cold, efficient businessman she had expected. There were moments, small ones, fleeting ones, when his mask would slip and she would catch a glimpse of something else, a vulnerability, a warmth, and it unsettled her. He had offered her everything, and now she found herself wondering if he was starting to want more than just the child he had hired her to carry. One evening, as Eva sat alone on the terrace, the setting sun casting long shadows over the meticulously manicured gardens, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to look to know it was David. He was always the same, his presence quiet, authoritative, yet somehow softer when it mattered. "Beautiful evening," he said, his voice not quite as stiff as usual, his tone more reflective than she had ever heard it. Eva glanced up at him, surprised by the shift in his demeanor. He wasn't in a suit as usual, but in something more casual. Jeans and a shirt that seemed to emphasize the fact that, underneath all the wealth and power, he was still a man. "Yeah," she replied, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. "It is." There was a long pause between them, the kind of silence that existed in a space where things were left unspoken. It was uncomfortable, but not in the way it had been before. This time it felt like the quiet before. Something important was about to be said. David stepped closer, taking a seat at the other end of the bench. He didn't look at her at first, but stared out at the garden, his brow furrowed as if he were struggling with something inside himself. Eva couldn't help but watch him, He was unlike anyone she had ever known. A man who could manipulate entire industries. Yet here he was, sitting beside her as though unsure of how to proceed. "I didn't expect this to be so hard," he said after a while, his voice low, almost hesitant. Eva's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had always been so sure of himself, so in control. To hear him speak with such uncertainty was a jolt to her system. "Hard?" she asked, glancing at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" David exhaled slowly, the words seeming to weigh on him. "I thought this would be simple. I thought I could just pay you, and you'd have my child, and that would be the end of it. But it's not. It's never that simple, is it?" Ava's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to be so open, so vulnerable. She had spent weeks trying to understand him, trying to figure out what made him tick. She had assumed he was just like every other rich, powerful man, cold, calculating, detached. But, sitting here, in the quiet of the evening, she saw something she hadn't seen before. "No," she said softly, "it's never simple." For a moment, there was silence between them. The garden rustled in the wind, the leaves moving like whispers in the breeze. David looked at her, his eyes a little softer now, and for the first time, Ava saw a flicker of something real in him, something that wasn't just business. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said, almost to himself. "I've always been in control, you know. My entire life has been about control. But this, it's like I don't know where to go from here." Ava couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. She had spent so long guarding her own heart, pushing people away. But now, seeing him like this, so human, it made her realize that they were more alike than she had thought. Both of them had been broken by the things they had been through. Both of them were trying to rebuild, but neither of them knew how to do it. "It's hard for me, too," she said quietly. "You think I'm just here because I wanted a way out of the streets, but it's more than that. I'm carrying your child, David. And no matter how much I try to separate myself from it, it's not that simple. You don't get to just buy someone's life like you're buying a car. It doesn't work that way." David's eyes softened at her words, and for the first time, he seemed to truly listen to her. "I know," he said quietly. "I didn't think about it that way. I thought it would be easier." "It's never easy," Ava whispered. They sat there together, the silence heavy, but not uncomfortable. Neither of them spoke for a while, and for the first time since their agreement began, Eva felt like they were on the same page. They were both in this together, whether they liked it or not. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over the garden, and for a moment, Ava forgot about the contract, the baby, and the walls she had built around her heart. She just sat there, with him, feeling like maybe, just maybe, things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. The days blurred together, each one slipping quietly into the next. And yet, in a way, they felt like they stretched endlessly before Eva. The mansion that had once felt cold and intimidating now felt like a cage of silk, its opulence overwhelming, its perfection suffocating. David had made good on his promise. Every need, every desire was met. She wanted for nothing. The soft sheets that lay across her bed were the best silk. The meals prepared for her were fit for royalty, and her medical care was attended to by the finest doctors. The life she had once imagined would be hers was unfolding before her. But with it came something else, a deep, unshakable emptiness. Eva had never known a life like this. She had been used to the grind of survival, the constant hustle to find food, shelter, a moment of peace. In the streets, everything had been uncertain, but there had been a clarity in it. Every day was a battle, yes, but it was a battle she understood. There was purpose in it. Here, however, in the mansion, everything was too smooth, too easy. She didn't need to fight for anything. Everything was done for her. And yet, It wasn't a relief. It was just more silence. The days slipped into a routine, but the monotony of it only deepened the chasm within her. She saw David less and less. He was always busy with his work, a man perpetually consumed by the demands of his empire. He was polite when they crossed paths, never cruel, but always distant. Their conversations had become mechanical, about doctor's appointments, the baby's progress, the contract that had bound them from the beginning. There was no real connection, no effort to bridge the gap between them. He was a man with a mission, and she was the means to an end. It was business, and business, she knew, didn't require anything more than the bare minimum of human interaction. But then, as the weeks passed, something began to change. It was subtle at first, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, but it was there, like a soft hum in the background of a song. It was David. The more they spoke, the more Ava began to notice the small shifts in his demeanor. It wasn't much, just a few moments here and there. A lingering glance, a pause before he answered her questions. His eyes, always guarded before, now seemed to soften when they met hers. It was as if he was beginning to see her as something more than just the woman carrying his child, more than the contract she had signed. It made her uneasy. She had signed up for this life of comfort, of security. She had been given everything she'd never thought she could have. And yet, the weight of the arrangement was beginning to bear down on her in ways she hadn't expected. She had agreed to be a surrogate, to carry David's child and hand it over when the time came. That was the deal. That was what she had wanted. But now, in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to feel, she realized something had changed. She wasn't just carrying his child. She was carrying a part of him too, and that terrified her. The baby, she had convinced herself, was just a task, something she had to do in exchange for a new life, a new future. But every kick, every flutter, every moment of connection to the child growing inside her made it harder to maintain that distance. This wasn't just a transaction. It was a bond, and it was growing stronger by the day. She tried to focus on the practical aspects. She would get through this, and then she would leave. That was the plan. She would walk away with the money David had promised her, a fresh start, and she would never look back. But it wasn't that simple, was it? Nothing ever was. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky blushed with hues of pink and orange, David appeared on the terrace. Ava was sitting there, lost in her thoughts, staring out at the sprawling garden below. She didn't hear him approach until he was standing beside her, his silhouette cutting a dark line against the fading light. "Beautiful night," he said quietly, his voice softer than usual. She didn't respond right away, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to feel about his sudden presence. She had been alone in the quiet for so long that his arrival, however gentle, felt like an intrusion. And yet, in some strange way, she welcomed it. There was something about him that had begun to unravel the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. She didn't know if it was the situation, the baby, or the simple fact that they had been in close proximity for so long, but she was beginning to see him differently. And it scared her. "Yeah," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is." David remained standing beside her, his hands in his pockets, his eyes focused on the horizon. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched out, comfortable in its quietness. But then, just as quickly, David broke the stillness. "How are you?" he asked, his voice low, almost tentative. Eva blinked, caught off guard by the question. He hadn't asked her that before. Not really. She had gotten used to him being distant, to him keeping things professional, always on task, always moving. But now, There was something in his voice that made her hesitate before answering. "I'm fine," she said, her words automatic. It was the answer she had given so many times before, the answer she had come to believe herself. But as soon as she said it, she felt a wave of doubt crash over her. Was she fine? Was she really fine? David turned to look at her, his eyes sharp, as if he could see through the facade she had put up. "No," he said quietly. "You're not. And I can't pretend that I don't notice." His words caught her off guard. She had been so careful to keep herself together, to bury the emotions that were threatening to break through. But now, with him standing there, watching her, everything felt raw and exposed. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for a long time. "I don't know what this is, David," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what any of this is anymore. I came here for one thing, to carry your child. But now—" Her voice trailed off, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Now it feels like everything is changing, and I don't know how to handle it." David's gaze softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ava saw something real in his eyes. It wasn't the detached businessman, the man who viewed her as a means to an end. It was David, a man who was beginning to wrestle with his own feelings, his own uncertainties. She had never seen him like this before, vulnerable in a way she hadn't thought possible. "I didn't want to make this complicated," David said quietly. "I thought I could keep it simple. Just a transaction. You carry the child and when it's over, we both walk away. But I've come to realize that it's not that easy. It's never that easy." Eva met his gaze, her heart pounding. She could see the conflict in him, the hesitation. He wasn't the man she had assumed he was. He was just as human as she was, and that made everything so much more complicated. "Don't want you to feel like this is just a deal, Eva," David continued. "I don't want to treat you like you're just a part of the plan. I care. And I know that makes this harder for both of us, but I don't want you to think that I don't see you. I don't want you to feel like you're invisible." But words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Eva felt the weight of them, and for the first time, she realized that she wasn't alone in this. She wasn't the only one struggling to figure out what this was, what it meant. David was just as caught up in it as she was. For a moment, the distance between them seemed to close, and all the barriers they had erected around themselves began to crumble. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something real, something that went beyond the simple exchange they had agreed upon. Eva looked at him, her chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to face. But in that moment, she understood something. It wasn't just about the baby. It wasn't just about the contract. It was about the choices they had both made and how they were both learning, in real time, how to navigate a life they hadn't expected. Eva woke up early the next morning, the sunlight filtering through the curtains and casting soft shadows across the room. The silence of the mansion was almost oppressive in its stillness. She sat up in bed and stared at the empty space beside her, as if waiting for some kind of signal, a sign that things might change, or at least that she wasn't as alone as she felt. She had settled into a routine over the past few weeks, one that was both comfortable and alien. The staff had become familiar faces: Stephanie, the ever-efficient assistant, and the doctors who monitored her pregnancy with a clinical precision that never seemed to take into account how she was really feeling. She was simply the woman carrying David's child, the one who had agreed to be a part of his plan. It was strange how quickly she had become used to the routine, even though it felt so foreign to her. She had been here long enough to know that nothing about her life was truly hers to decide. It had all been planned for her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had allowed herself to begin questioning whether she could walk away once this was all over. She had been so determined to keep her emotions at bay, to see this as a simple transaction, a way out of the life she had left behind. And yet, as the days went by, she found herself becoming more and more tangled in the threads of the life she was now living, and in the man who had made it possible. David's presence had been scarce recently. She had seen him only in passing, and their conversations had remained businesslike, almost cold. But the absence of his presence, the way he seemed to vanish when she needed him most, left her with a growing sense of confusion. Was he simply too busy with his own life to care about her? Or was there something more beneath the surface that neither of them was willing to acknowledge? It was the quiet moments when he wasn't around that gave her time to think. She spent hours walking the grounds of the mansion, letting the solitude fill the spaces inside her that had been hollow for so long. The baby kicked within her as if reminding her that, for all the uncertainty she felt, there was something real growing inside her. She wasn't just a woman in a contract anymore. She was a mother. Yet despite the undeniable connection she had to the child, Eva couldn't help but feel like an outsider in her own life. She had spent so many years fighting for survival, fighting to carve out a small space for herself in a world that seemed intent on keeping her down. And now everything was being handed to her on a silver platter. It should have been a dream. But the more she tried to embrace it, the more she felt like a prisoner to her own choices. The life she had always imagined, the one where she could be free, had slipped away from her without her even realizing it. One evening, as the air grew cooler and the light from the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, David appeared again. She hadn't seen him in days. His footsteps were steady as he approached her, his presence commanding. But tonight there was something different in the air. It wasn't the usual sense of distance she had come to expect from him. This time, there was a softness to his expression, a tension in his shoulders that she hadn't noticed before. "You look lost in thought," he said, his voice quieter than usual. He was standing a few feet away, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. Eva looked up at him, surprised to find him there, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to be honest. "I am," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I don't know what to do with myself anymore." David didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her feel exposed. It wasn't the cold gaze of the businessman she had come to know. It was something else. Something she hadn't seen in him before. "I thought this would be simpler," he said, his words coming slowly, as though he were carefully considering each one. "I thought I could compartmentalize it. Just pay you, have you carry my child and move on. But it's not that easy, is it?" Eva felt a pang in her chest at his words. She knew exactly what he meant. She had thought the same thing too. When she first signed the contract, she had told herself it was just a transaction, nothing more. She had to separate her emotions from the reality of the situation. She had to protect herself from the bond she knew would form between her and the child. But now, it was all too real. "No," she said softly. "It's not that easy. You can't just throw money at something like this and expect it to be over when you want it to be." David's expression softened, and for the first time he didn't seem like the man who had orchestrated everything with cold precision. He seemed human. It was a small shift, but it felt like a breakthrough, like the first crack in the walls he had so carefully built around himself. "I've been thinking a lot about this," he said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "About you. About what this really means. And I know I haven't been fair to you. I know I've treated you like just another part of the plan, just another transaction. But I'm starting to realize that you're not just a part of my plan. You're a person, and I haven't treated you like that." Eva looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never heard him speak like this before. His words, though simple, carried so much weight. She had always seen him as a man who controlled everything, who never let anyone in. But now, standing before her, he was admitting his own flaws, his own mistakes. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. She didn't know if it was forgiveness or understanding, but it was something that made her feel less alone. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You haven't treated me like a person, but neither have I. I've been trying so hard to separate myself from this situation, from everything it means. But I can't. I can't pretend I don't care. And that scares me." David took a step, closer to her, his eyes searching hers. "I'm scared too," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't expect any of this. I didn't expect to care, but I do." For a moment they stood there in silence, the world around them fading into the background. It was as if, in that moment, they were both facing the truth. This was no longer just a contract, no longer just a business deal. There was something more between them, something neither of them had planned for or wanted. And it was that unspoken truth that bound them together, whether they liked it or not. "I don't know what this means," Ava said quietly, her voice trembling. "But I can't pretend it's just about the money anymore. I can't pretend. I don't feel something for you, something I didn't expect to feel." David's gaze softened and he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I don't want you to pretend," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I don't want you to shut me out anymore. Whatever this is, whatever happens next, I want to face it with you." Ava's heart raced as she looked at him, her breath shallow, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. She didn't know what to do with the feelings rising within her. But in that moment, she realized something important. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the contract. And it wasn't even about the baby. It was about the two of them, standing here acknowledging something real that neither of them had expected. And no matter what happened, no matter where their paths took them from here, it was something they couldn't ignore anymore. As the grey evening wore on, Eva and David stood there in the fading light, the weight of their unspoken words hanging in the air between them. They didn't need to say anything else. The moment had been enough. For the first time in a long time, Eva felt like she wasn't just playing a part. She wasn't just the woman carrying a child for a rich man. She was a person, a human being, with desires, fears, and feelings that mattered. And for the first time, David had seen her, truly seen her. And for that, she was grateful. Eva could no longer ignore the pull of the emotions swirling inside her. It had been weeks since that night on the terrace, since David had opened up to her in a way that had shattered the cold barrier she had carefully constructed between them. The days following that conversation had felt different, shifting and uncertain. The tension between them was no longer about the contract, no longer about the cold transaction they had agreed to. It was something deeper, something unspoken, and neither of them seemed willing to address it head-on. But it hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to break. She had always been the kind of person who preferred control. It had been her shield in a world that had taught her that survival was about keeping others at arm's length. She had never been good at letting people in. Even when she had agreed to David's offer, she had done so with the intention of keeping her heart and her emotions sealed away. She wasn't going to get attached to this child. She wasn't going to get attached to David. This was business. That was the deal. Simple, clear, and without complications. But now, sitting in her room one evening, looking out over the expansive grounds of the mansion, she could no longer deny what was happening inside her. It wasn't just the baby. It was David, too. Somewhere between the small gestures and the quiet conversations, something had shifted. It wasn't just the softness in his eyes when he looked at her. It was the way he seemed to be letting her. See him letting her in when all he had ever known was how to guard himself. But she couldn't afford to be distracted. She had made her choice. This life wasn't hers to keep. When the child was born, when the contract had been fulfilled, she would walk away. That was the plan. But the plan didn't seem as simple as it had before. There were too many things she couldn't control anymore. The soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Stephanie standing there. She was always polite, efficient, but today her eyes seemed a little softer than usual. "David wants to see you," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of something more. Eva nodded, feeling the familiar knot tighten in her stomach. The thought of facing David filled her with both anticipation and apprehension. She wasn't sure what he wanted, but the mere idea of him requesting her presence felt charged, like a question waiting to be answered. As she made her way down the long hallway to his office, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors, Eva felt a sense of inevitability settle over her. She had known this moment was coming, knew that eventually they would have to face the shift in their relationship. The agreement had started as something straightforward. She would carry his child, and they would part ways. But it had grown into something more, something neither of them had anticipated. She could no longer pretend that their connection was just business. It was personal now, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. David's office was just as imposing as the rest of the mansion, modern and sleek, with a large desk at the center of the room, papers neatly arranged, and a view of the city stretching out in the distance. He was standing by the window when she entered, his back to her, as if lost in thought. There was an air of tension around him, something heavier than usual, and it made her hesitate. "Eva," he said quietly, without turning around. His voice was low, softer than it had ever been, but there was an edge to it that made her heart race. "David," she responded, unsure of what to expect. He turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers, and for the first time in what felt like a long time, she saw something raw in his eyes. It wasn't the cold businessman she had known, the man who had offered her money in exchange for her body's service. This was a man who seemed to be grappling with something that wasn't. "I'm easy for him to face. I've been thinking," he started, his words tentative. "About everything. About this agreement. About what's happened between us." Eva felt her breath catch in her throat, a sense of dread mixing with something else. Curiosity, hope, fear. She knew this was coming. They couldn't keep pretending, not with everything that had been said, not with the bond that had begun to form between them. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. David stepped toward her, his hands in his pockets, his expression tense. "I mean that I've been trying to convince myself that this was simple, that it was just a business deal, but it's not. Not for me, anyway." Eva swallowed, unsure of what to say. She had known this was coming, but hearing him admit it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. She had been trying so hard to hold everything together, to keep her emotions in check, but the reality of what they were both facing was starting to crash down on her. "I didn't think it would affect me like this," David continued, his voice low, almost vulnerable. "I didn't think I'd get attached. But I can't ignore it anymore. I care about what happens to you. I care about you." His words hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of everything they had been avoiding. Eva's heart raced as she tried to process what he was saying. She had always kept herself at a distance, always been so guarded, and now, standing here, facing him, it felt like everything she had built around herself was beginning to crumble. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "I didn't ask for any of this. I came here because I thought it would be simple, that I could just do this one thing, walk away and start over. But it's not that easy." "It's never that easy." David reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers before he gently placed it on her arm. The touch was tentative, as if he was unsure of how far to go, unsure of how much she was willing to let him in. "I know," he said softly. "I've made things more complicated than I ever meant to. But I can't ignore it anymore. I can't. Pretend that this," he gestured between them, "that this isn't real." Eva looked up at him, her heart aching in her chest. This wasn't what she had expected. This wasn't part of the plan. She had agreed to be a surrogate, to carry his child and then leave. That had been the arrangement. But now, standing here with him, feeling the weight of his words, she realized something crucial. There was no such thing as a simple transaction when it came to human lives. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. "I don't know how to deal with this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to deal with you, with this child, with everything that's happening. I'm not sure I can just walk away from it when it's all over." David's eyes softened, his hand moving to gently cup her face, his touch warm and comforting. "You don't have to walk away from anything, Ava. You don't have to do this alone." Eva closed her eyes at the touch, feeling the warmth of his hand on her skin, a stark contrast to the cold walls she had built around herself for so long. She had been so determined to keep her distance, to keep everything in its place. But now, with his hand on her face, she realized that the walls had already come down. It wasn't about the money, the baby, or the contract anymore. It was about the two of them, trying to navigate a life they hadn't planned for, one that had begun to take on a life of its own. "I don't know what to do," Ava admitted, her voice breaking. "I never expected any of this. I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know if I can trust myself." David's gaze softened and he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You don't have to trust me right away," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not asking for anything from you, except for the chance to try." And in that moment, Ava realized that she wasn't just a part of his plan anymore. She was part of something real, something they would have to figure out together, no matter how complicated it became. The days that followed the conversation on the terrace were marked by a strange and unsettling tension between Eva and David. Both of them had spoken truths they hadn't planned on sharing, and now that they had, everything felt different. It was as if they had crossed a line that they couldn't easily uncross, a line between what was professional and what was personal, between business and something more fragile. They hadn't said it outright, but Eva could feel it in the way. David's gaze lingered a little longer than it used to, in the way he would offer her small, unexpected gestures of care. It wasn't love, she told herself. Not yet. But something was undeniably shifting, and she wasn't sure how to navigate the emotions that were beginning to stir inside her. She had always prided herself on being able to maintain control over her emotions, her life. After all, it had been a matter of survival for so long. In the streets, where she had spent years scraping by, there had been no room for weakness, no room for anything that could expose her vulnerability. She had built walls around herself, high and thick, to protect herself from a world that had only ever shown her cruelty. But here, in this mansion, surrounded by luxury and isolation, those walls were starting to crumble, bit by bit. David's behavior had changed, too. At first, he had been the epitome of control, of calm, never letting anything break his composed, calculated exterior. But now, Eva noticed the subtle shifts in him. His tone was softer when he spoke to her. His questions were more thoughtful. There was a kindness in his gestures, an attentiveness that seemed to go beyond what was necessary. And for Eva, that was dangerous. It made her question everything she thought she knew about him, and about herself. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in rich golden hues, Eva found herself standing in front of the large windows in the dining room, looking out over the garden. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Some sign, maybe, some clarity. She had been feeling more and more like a stranger in her own life. This mansion, this perfect, pristine world, was supposed to be her escape, but instead, it felt like a trap. The child growing inside her was the only thing that felt real. But even that, she feared, would be taken from her the moment it was born. She had agreed to give the child to David, to leave it behind and walk away. That was the deal. but it was getting harder to imagine walking away from it all. Every day, as the baby grew inside her, Eva found herself forming an attachment she hadn't planned on. She couldn't help it. The child was a part of her, a living being that she could feel inside her every day. How could she just walk away from that? How could she just let go? Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. She didn't need to turn around to know it was David. His presence had become almost like a shadow in the mansion, a constant but subtle reminder that things between them were not as simple as they once seemed. Eva. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" She turned to face him, meeting his gaze. There was something different about him today. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a softness she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the concern she had seen before. It was something more. It was vulnerability, and that was the last thing she expected from him. David had always been the man in control, the one who never showed weakness, never let anyone see how deeply he felt. But now, standing in front of her, he was different. He seemed unsure. "Of course," Eva replied, her voice steady, though inside she was anything but. She had grown used to his presence, but now, the weight of the moment made her uneasy. David stepped closer, his gaze not leaving hers. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about this arrangement, about you and the baby." His voice faltered slightly, as though the words were difficult for him to say. "I know we agreed on what would happen after the birth. I know I asked you to leave once it was all over, but I'm not sure I can let you go." Eva's heart skipped a beat. She had prepared herself for this moment, the moment when David would be ready to discard her, to sever the connection between them and return to his life. But this was unexpected. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was afraid of what he might say, but at the same time, she found herself wanting to hear it. David exhaled slowly, his face unreadable. "I thought I could just have you carry my child, hand you the money, and move on with my life. But it's not that simple, Eva. I've been avoiding this, avoiding how I really feel. But I can't ignore it anymore. I don't want to lose you." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with an intensity she wasn't prepared for. She had known, deep down, that this moment would come, that the growing connection between them couldn't be avoided, but she wasn't ready for the emotions it stirred in her. "I don't want to lose you either," she admitted softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm scared, David. I'm scared of what this means, of what we're both starting to feel. We made a deal. I agreed to this because I thought it was the only way out for me. But now I don't know." David stepped forward, his presence filling the space between them. "I know this isn't easy. I know we've both been pretending that this was just about the baby, but it's not. It's about us too. I care about you, Eva, more than I ever expected. More than I ever wanted." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Eva didn't know how to respond. She hadn't expected this, not from David. She had come here for a chance at a new life, not for a relationship, not for any emotional attachment. But somewhere along the way that had changed. She had let herself care, and now she had no idea what to do with it. "I didn't come here looking for love," Eva said quietly, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I came here because I thought it was the only way I could survive, the only way I could get out of the life I had. I didn't expect to care about you. I didn't expect any of this." David's gaze softened, and he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I didn't expect it either," he admitted. "But I can't ignore it anymore. I want to build something with you, Eva. Something real. Not just for the baby, but for us. I don't want to walk away from this. Not now. Eva's chest tightened as she looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been so focused on the contract, on the idea of simply carrying the child and walking away, that she had never allowed herself to consider the possibility of something more. But now, standing here with him, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, she realized that she couldn't ignore what was growing between them. It wasn't just about the baby. It was about the two of them. It was about the choices they had made and how those choices had brought them to this moment. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what this means for us, for me. I've spent so long protecting myself, building walls around my heart. But now I'm not sure how to take them down." David gave her a small smile, a look of understanding in his eyes. "You don't have to take them down all at once," he said softly. "But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, Ava. We'll figure this out together." In that moment, something inside Ava shifted. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a declaration of love. But it was enough. It was enough to make her realize that she didn't have to do this alone. That maybe, just maybe, she could trust David. Not just with the baby, but with her heart as well. The room was quiet, the weight of their words hanging in the air like a promise. It wasn't clear what would happen next, but for the first time, Eva didn't feel as though she had to face it alone. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future here for them both. The following days after their conversation left Eva with a profound sense of uncertainty. It wasn't that she was afraid of the emotions that had begun to unfurl between her and David. It was more the realization that everything she had known about herself, about her life, was being questioned in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had come to this mansion with a single purpose: to fulfill the contract she had signed, to walk away with a future she had longed for, to leave behind the cold, unforgiving world that had shaped her. But now, that world seemed distant, replaced by something far more complex and intangible. The walls she had built around herself for years, walls that had kept her safe from harm, were starting to crumble. And with each brick that fell, a part of her was exposed, raw and vulnerable. The fear she had once lived with, the fear of being too seen, too known, began to resurface, stronger than ever. She had become more than just a vessel for David's child. She was a person, and that realization brought with it a new set of challenges she wasn't sure she was ready for. David's presence in her life had changed, and not just in the way he spoke to her, but in the way he was trying to connect with her. It wasn't just about the child anymore. There was a genuine attempt on his part to understand her, to see her, to acknowledge that their relationship was no longer simply transactional. The man who had once seemed so distant, so controlled, was beginning to show glimpses of a side she had never expected to see. He wasn't just the businessman who had hired her to carry his child. He was someone struggling with his own emotions, trying to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming. And in that struggle, Ava felt a sense of connection that frightened her. It was the small things that David did that caught her off guard. The way he would ask about her day, not just the usual questions about her medical appointments or the baby's progress, but real questions. Questions that made her feel like she mattered. He would offer to bring her something to eat, or ask her if she wanted to walk with him through the gardens. They were simple acts, but they held weight. They meant something. They made her feel seen. And yet, the very fact that she noticed these things, noticed how much she had started to care, left her conflicted. This was never supposed to be more than a transaction. She had agreed to carry his child, and in return, she would get the money and the fresh start she had dreamed of. That was the deal. But with every passing day, Ava found herself questioning whether she could truly walk away from it all when the time came. Would she really be able to separate herself from the child growing inside her? Would she be able to walk away from David, from the man who had, without her realizing it, begun to break down the walls she had so carefully constructed. The night before her due date, Eva found herself walking the length of the garden in the cold night air, the quiet of the mansion surrounding her. It was a beautiful night, the moon full and bright, casting silver light over the manicured landscape. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt suspended in time, when she could almost pretend that none of this was happening, that she was just a woman, standing alone in the night, unsure of her future, but hopeful nonetheless. It was then that she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't have to look to know who it was. His presence had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. David was there, standing beside her in silence, his hands tucked in his pockets. The weight of his gaze on her was enough to make her heart skip a beat, and for a long moment, they both stood there, just listening to the night, not speaking, not knowing what to say. Finally, it was David who broke the silence. His voice was softer than usual, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "Eva, I've been thinking about everything. About what happens next. About us." Eva turned to face him, her heart pounding. The words were familiar, but this time, there was something different in the way he spoke them. Something heavier, as though he too was trying to make sense of everything that had unfolded between them. "I know we've been through a lot," he continued, his eyes meeting hers, "and I know that we never intended for any of this to be anything more than a contract. But I can't help how I feel. I can't just let this go. I don't want to lose you, Eva." Eva's breath caught in her throat. She had expected him to say something like this, but hearing it, feeling the sincerity in his voice, hit her harder than she could have anticipated. She had known that there was a growing connection between them, but she hadn't fully understood it until this moment. It wasn't just the baby. It wasn't just the arrangement. It was the shared space they had created together, the quiet moments, the unspoken understanding. It was the way they had both found something in each other they hadn't realized they were searching for. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do, David," she said, her voice trembling. "I came here to fulfill a deal, to carry your child and walk away. But now I don't know what to feel, what to want. I don't know what happens after the baby is born, and I don't know if I can just leave." David took a step closer, to her, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. "I don't want you to leave, Eva. I don't want this to end just because the baby is born. I want to build a life with you, not just for the child, but for us. I know it's complicated. I know we're both scared. But I don't want to walk away from this. I don't want to let you go." Eva closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling heavily on her chest. She had thought she was prepared for this moment, that she could simply carry the child and walk away when it was over. But now, standing here with him, feeling the truth of his words, she realized that nothing had been simple about this. Nothing had been easy. She had spent so long guarding herself, keeping herself apart from the world, from David, from everything. But now, with the baby so close to being born, with David standing in front of her, she couldn't deny it anymore. "David, I don't know if I can trust this," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't know if I can trust myself. I've spent so long building walls, protecting myself. I don't know how to tear them down." David looked at her with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "You don't have to tear them down all at once, Eva," he said softly. "You don't have to let go of everything overnight. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together." Eva looked at him, feeling the truth of his words settle into her heart. For so long she had been afraid to let anyone in, to trust anyone with the pieces of herself. She had hidden away. But here, with David, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders anymore. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to try with you." David smiled softly, a warmth in his eyes that she had never seen before. "That's all I'm asking for," he said quietly. And in that moment, as they stood there together in the quiet of the night, Eva realized that the future wasn't as uncertain as she had thought. It wasn't about the contract. It wasn't about the money. It was about the choices they had made and the path they were willing to walk together. No matter how complicated, no matter how hard, it was theirs to navigate. And for the first time, Eva didn't feel alone. She didn't feel like a stranger in her own life. She felt like she was finally beginning to find her place in a world she had once thought would never accept. Her Eva's journey was one of self-discovery, transformation, and the unexpected power of connection. She entered David's world with one clear purpose: to carry his child and walk away, using the arrangement as a means to escape her difficult past. However, as the story unfolded, Eva found herself entangled in emotions she hadn't anticipated. The contract became more than just a transaction. It became a path that led to deeper introspection and understanding, not only of her relationship with David, but of herself. In allowing herself to connect with David, she discovered the strength to break down the walls she had spent years building, realizing that love and trust, though frightening, were not weaknesses, but sources of true strength. By the end of her journey, Eva found herself not just as a mott. The key lesson from Eva's story is that life is rarely as simple as we expect. We cannot control everything, especially our emotions. Sometimes the very thing we try to avoid, vulnerability, ends up leading us to the most profound and meaningful connections. By embracing uncertainty and opening ourselves to others, we can unlock the doors to a future we never imagined. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us in creating more captivating content. Your support keeps us motivated to bring you more exciting tales. Stay tuned for what's next.